Honorable Chair, distinguished colleagues, worthy opponents, and esteemed guests. I stand before you today to represent my team, Team G of Group 4, to argue the affirmative with respect to the question of should African nations invest in gene therapy as a long-term solution for chronic and genetic diseases. To begin with, I must stress that we live amidst a treatable catastrophe. This is exemplified by recent statistics for the sickle cell crisis we currently live in Africa. Recent statistics from the World Health Organization highlight that 80% of the global sickle cell disease cases are localized to sub-Saharan Africa with a mortality rate of upwards of 80% for children under the age of 5 in some regions. Altogether, this crystallizes that the reality in Africa is fundamentally different from that lived elsewhere. In Africa, we see the sickle cell disease as a debilitating, neglected disease causing immense preventable suffering and childhood mortality, whilst elsewhere they benefit from life-saving gene therapies such as Casgevy and Lifegenia that have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and are available elsewhere in the United Kingdom and the European Union, offering a foundational cure. Whilst not a single instance of these therapeutic life-saving treatments have been made available to sub-Saharan Africa, where the prevalence reaches its global maximum. What this highlights is that there is this profound and unjustifiable asymmetry that exists with respect to not only the sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is only the more prominent pathological manifestation amidst a landscape of genetic conditions with high prevalence in Africa, including the G6PD deficiency, beta thalassemia, and the APOL gene variants that have been invariably linked to kidney disease. And per recent studies such as Tur and colleagues, these have been highlighted to have mutations that are uniquely African. And this is without also considering that Africa is home to 25% of the world's aggregate disease burden, and that only 1.1% of the global clinical trials are being held in Africa. And altogether, this is another exemplification of the profound and unjustifiable asymmetry we seek to address here today. We also take note of the translational gap wherein Africa is systematically being excluded from the global innovation pipeline. According to the Access to Medicine Index, there exists a disparity between the more severe clinical trials destined for pivotal late-stage trials. Only 27.5% of late-stage research and development projects from the world's 20 leading pharmaceutical firms included a single African nation. These clinical trials serve as the gatekeeping mechanism for global innovation. Africa's exclusion from participation in these clinical trials, namely those of which are involved and implicated in gene therapy, means that Africans will remain destined to receive therapeutically inferior options. We take note that as of today and as of the National Library of Medicine Clinical Trials website, only 5 clinical trials destined for cellular and gene therapy exists in Africa, 4 of which are localized in Egypt and 1 is in South Africa. And if you compare this with the growing disparity, such as there are upwards of 200 clinical trials in America and upwards of 150 in each of the European Union and China, this exemplifies this translational gap and crystallizes it very, very clearly. We would like to argue in favor of the institution of strategic investment for gene therapy initiatives in Africa, namely because Africa's genetic diversity holds the key to unlocking the future of medicine. This is what has been advocated by many scientists, including Ramsey and colleagues in their landmark paper in Human Molecular Genetics, wherein they note that if you are to at random select two African individuals, they would hold a greater degree of genetic diversity and genomic divergence in relative to you selecting at random any other two individuals from any other continent. This is not a case of academic curiosity, but rather the essential foundation for developing safer and more effective therapies for all of humanity. In fact, another landmark paper published in Science Translational Medicine has noted that therapies developed without African genetic data have diminished efficacy and compromised safety profiles for continental populations. The investment in African-led initiatives generate genomic knowledge for universal significance. Um, we also argue that there is already a foundation for leadership that is already in place. This notion and this skepticism regarding the African institutional readiness remains unfounded in our view and contradictory to the empirical reality. We highlight that there are a number of different initiatives, including the Human Heredity and Health in Africa, the H3A BioNet that seeks to institutionalize and bring together a continent-wide bioinformatics network led by Nicola Mulder and colleagues of the University of Cape Town. We take note of the existence of the Consortium for Advanced Research Training in Africa that have systematically called for many postdoctoral research fellowships to be afforded to researchers in Africa seeking to integrate themselves within the field of cellular and genomic therapy. The existence of the African CDC, as well as other notable institutions such as the African Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Disease, wherein under the leadership of Dr. Christian Happy in Rockefeller University in Nigeria, they have pioneered research that seeks to use CRISPR technologies to address this, infectious diseases. We argue that this can be leveraged and extended to chronic and genetic diseases as well, in addition to the African Clinical Research Network. Altogether, this highlights not a lack of scientific competence, but rather what needs to be addressed is a chronic underfunding and insufficient industrial partnerships, which would greatly benefit the African continent. We argue for the need. We argue that there is also a unified regulatory environment that is in place and taking shape. We've already alluded to this earlier with the Africa CDC, wherein under the leadership of the African CDC and the African Union, this has given birth to the African Medicines Agency in November 2021, which is a landmark institution with the mandate to harmonize regulatory frameworks, streamline approval pathways, and establish rigorous standards for advanced therapies across Africa. Africa indeed can adopt comprehensive governance frameworks already developed by the WHO Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and there is a tendency to move towards the global convergence on technical requirements under the supervision by bodies such as the International Council for Harmonization, which will reduce fragmentation and lower barriers to multinational development. As proof of the readiness of the African continent for the adoption of cellular and gene therapies, we draw your attention to the fact that South Africa is now home to 3 accredited centers meeting the same rigorous international standards as those across Europe and North Africa for the implementation of cell and gene therapy. This accreditation is offered by the Joint Accreditation Committee of the International Stem Cell Transplantation and the European Bone Marrow Transplantation bodies, and also likewise the existence of the Sickle Cell Disease Center in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania is successfully implementing advanced therapies and achieving documented clinical trials as it relates to sickle cell disease upon coordination with the European Union. Both of these are testify to the readiness of the African continent for a continent-wide adoption of cellular and gene therapies and the strategic investment therein. We also call upon the innovation in manufacturing, which will unlock scalable access. Our opponents may note that the current autologous therapies are logistically complex and expensive to manufacture, and we do take note of this. To help combat this, we would draw their attention to the fact that currently there is research being done to make allogenic therapies manufactured from donor cells indeed available to the public at large. These will function like conventional pharmaceuticals with simpler logistics and storage and make them more suitable for broad distribution across the entire continent. We would like to draw their attention to a landmark study wherein they have studied the feasibility of the adoption of CAR T cell therapies being broadly distributed across the African continent and being made available in an allogenic manner. And this has indeed been documented to be feasible, as demonstrated by Thompson and colleagues in their landmark paper published earlier this year. We also draw their attention to the fact that we can also establish regional manufacturing hubs to make the production capacity closer to patient populations as a strategic imperative. This will reduce investment in technical infrastructure and will require investment in workforce development, regulatory systems, although frameworks like the African Entrepreneurship Hub's technology transfer model are already in place and ready to support this. We also have a blueprint for action, and this is where we call upon the adoption of proven hub and spoke frameworks to operationalize through a practical validated framework the concentration of capital intensive manufacturing and expertise in centralized hubs to ensure that the distribution of treatment delivery through a network of spoke facilities is indeed done to maximize efficiency and ensure quality control to expand patient access. Indeed, comprehensive feasibility analysis have identified that there are 3 different viable options to systematically operationalize therapy delivery across Africa, including that of which is for gene therapy. The choice will ultimately depend on the strategic priorities, whether it is to focus on implementation speed, geographic equity, or long-term sustainability. And hopefully we would like to move from the first model, which focuses on a centralized hub that leverages the accredited centers in South Africa, towards a more quasi-distributed network wherein multiple regional hubs exist across the continent, coordinated by a central organization for standards and logistics, which represents, in our view, the most scalable and sustainable long-term vision for the adoption of gene therapy across the entire continent. What we're calling for thus is a strategic alliance for a new era in African health. This transformation requires a deliberate and coordinated effort amongst African leadership and amidst also global partnerships being established to be established on the foundation of mutual interest and equitable collaboration. We call upon the African Union and the African Medicines Agency, national ministers, African development banks, global pharmaceutical industries and biotech, and also the global philanthropic initiatives to catalyze early stage research and development, training, and capacity building to de-risk later investment. We take note of the existing initiatives wherein major centers, including the African Center of Medical Excellence in Nigeria, has recently received funding to the tune of $75 million to catalyze research and development being done in gene therapy initiatives, as well as the grant being given by the Bill and Melinda Gates, its foundation, to the tune of $200 million to catalyze his research and development into cellular and gene therapies to address HIV and chronic and genetic diseases. These represent the stepping stones, and we look forward to more initiatives of this kind being adopted. Our final constructive argument is that the cost is merely but a solvable challenge and should not represent an immutable barrier. We do concur with our opponents that the current landscape for treatment is such that the treatments such as Case-Giva and Lyfgenia being mentioned earlier represent very high costs to patients, and are indeed marketed at around $2 million per dose at present. Although we can circumvent this with the adoption of value-based pricing and more alternative pricing architectures that are economically rational and defensible. We can learn from pilot studies conducted in Italy and Spain, in which I would have adopted outcome-linked payments, in Germany in the form of rebate structures, to build models suited for African contexts. We can leverage the scale of the disproportionate disease burden in the African continent to negotiate substantially more affordable pricing. And altogether, these have been mentioned as part of a landmark paper published in Nature earlier in 2024 entitled A Roadmap for Affordable Genetic Medicines, which provides a comprehensive evidence-based plan for expanding access beyond wealthy markets, which I imagine will be a key argument brought forth by our opposition. To address some of the core challenges I anticipate are going to be brought up by our esteemed opposition, I would like to draw their attention that if they are to bring up the issue of prohibitive cost, we have already seen that this can be addressed by volume-based pricing, innovative financing, and value-based models. The manufacturing complexity may be itself solved with the provision of allogenic off-the-shelf therapies that are emerging to simplify logistics, and the strategic investment in regional manufacturing hubs to localize production and reduce costs in accordance with the hub and spoke framework. And we take note of their potential argument in that brain drain wherein scientists may leave due to a lack of opportunity, and we do take note of the examples such as Christian Happy in Nigeria, amidst other examples as well, wherein this investment has created institutional conditions to retain and attract top talent. And we also take note of the funding that has been received by these other centers we have mentioned and alluded to earlier, to ensure equitable international collaborations, providing compelling career pathways across the continent. Ultimately, what we are calling for is a strategic investment that must target the entirety of the value chain. We call for local diagnostics and the investment of next generation sequencing capacity and specialist training to close the diagnostic gap and bring testing to the continent. We call for an expansion of the talent pipeline to integrate biotechnology and bioengineering curricula into African universities. And as an example of this, we take note of the American Gene and Cellular Therapy Initiative and its collaboration with the Muhimbili University in Kenya, which has specifically addressed this issue, and we look forward to seeing this expanded continent-wide. We take note also of the need for sufficient technology transfer and regulatory harmonization, although these can be addressed with similar initiatives as that of the Africa Entrepreneurship Hub and the African Medicines Agency that has a mandate to create streamlined, rigorous standards for advanced therapies across the continent. In closing, I would like to urge you to all argue in favor of the motions, such that this is important because the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of investment. The path of inaction is laden with perpetuated inequity, thousands of preventable deaths, scientific stagnation and exclusion, and a continued dependency on external solutions, whereas the path in terms of strategic investment is destined to aid millions of lives being saved. It positions Africa in the frontier in terms of the global scientific leadership. It fosters economic growth and the proliferation of new industries, and it retains the African scientific sovereignty and the right of Africans to their own self-determination. we urge you therein to argue in favor of our motion, because the question is not whether Africa can afford this investment. It is whether or not we deem comfortable or we can live with the reality of the current African exclusion and afford the human and strategic cost of inaction. It is in our view the right moment for Africa to reclaim its position amidst the global innovation economy, and it is an investment in scientific sovereignty, strategic self-determination, and the future of millions, one that is characterized by foundational blocks that are currently in place, with a viable plan and the need being undeniable. The era of waiting has concluded, and we urge for the era of leadership to commence. I thank you very much for your consideration, and we look forward to entertaining your questions. We urge you to argue in favor of our motion. Thank you very much.